Okay. Can you
Thank you,
be,
sir, for
can you be
your,
there?
yes.
Can you meet in person or can you, or do you have to go by internet? Can you be there in person?
Yes. I am conducting live because sometimes some
Well, let's begin with a word of prayer, shall we? Lord God, I thank you today for being with us this week. I pray, Lord, for my brothers and sisters, especially those who are in some kind of lockdown and not able to get out. Lord, I pray you'll just keep them safe and healthy physically. Lord, I pray your protection upon us all during this time. I pray, Lord, also that you'll help us not to be discouraged because of what's going on, Lord, but to stay strong and to keep trusting in you. We pray also you'll help us through this class tonight, that we can understand better what these books of the Bibles mean, and even what they can mean to us. So we just pray and ask for your help during this time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
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 Well, let's begin with looking at the book of Leviticus. So here are some notes on that. The book of Leviticus. Well, most people, when they come to the book of Leviticus, they kind of like to skip over it because it's probably one of the more difficult books in the Bible to read, because it's just a lot of repetition and a lot of description of the law and of regulations and of the sacrificial system. And it can be kind of boring, I guess, in a way. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean for us? The first thing is for us to try to understand it a little bit. There's a lot in here that we do not understand because it was meant for the people back then, and they had a better understanding of what is described. But for us as Christians, we can at least think about the theology, and then some of the laws that are described do not directly apply to us, but we can look for the principle that is behind the laws that are written about here. And the principle will apply to us. Well, Leviticus, the central purpose to this book of the Bible is that it gives instruction to the congregation about cultic matters. Now, this word cultic is a technical word used in Bible study, and it means the worship practices. So I'll just put that in parentheses here, the worship practices. And sometimes the word cult is used there. Not cult as in a false religion, but actually this word cult or cultic has to do with the religious practices. And so sometimes you'll see this word in a different Bible study context. So it basically means the worship practices. So this book describes the worship practices of ancient Israel. It is right in the middle of the Pentateuch. So we have 2 books before it and then 2 books after it. And so these worship practices focus upon sacrifices. So that's one thing we have to think about when we come to Leviticus. What do the sacrifices mean? And as we get into this, we need to think about how God gave these sacrifices to the people as the way to help them understand his forgiveness and his holiness. And God was teaching these people. The name comes from Aaron and the Levites. The Levites were the ones who administered the laws. They are the ones who made sure the people kept the laws. It looks like this book is almost like a manual for the priests, what they were supposed to do. But it is actually addressed to all the people, not just the priesthood, but to all the people. It contains two different types of literature. Of course, it has the laws, and many of those are, a lot of them at the beginning. But in between the laws, there's also what is called narrative. A narrative is the story. So there's also story mixed up with the laws. And so this book has some progression. In other words, the story continues. The story of the book of Exodus continues into the book of Leviticus. The context. This is really part of the Sinai teaching that Moses was given by God and that Moses shared to the people. It comes after the problem with the golden calf back in Exodus 31, 32. So this is after that, and it is as the people have built the tabernacle, they have made it. Now, these are the instructions of what they are to do with the tabernacle. And so these Leviticus it's like the instructions for what the people are to do with the tabernacle. It's part of the larger story. The time now is about the 13th month. It's been over a year since the Exodus. We need to, when we read Leviticus, we have to keep in mind the book of Exodus. So Exodus, have all that up in our thinking. God gave the law to Moses. They built the tabernacle. They're out in the desert going towards the promised land. And so this is the instructions for what they do with all of that. The central theme is holiness. God is active in and among the people, and God is active through the rituals and the sacrifices that the people do. This book emphasizes God's power and desire to make his people holy. Holiness is the key idea of this book. Holiness. So we have to think about what is holiness and what does Leviticus teach us about holiness. Whenever we think about holiness, we need to also think about the problem of sin. Holiness is the answer to sin. Holiness, and what we see here in Leviticus, that's God's answer to what Adam and Eve did and how that problem of sin has just continued. We see it throughout the Pentateuch so far, and it's going to continue throughout the Old Testament. But there's a special way that God provided for the people to be in relationship with him. So sin is opposite of holiness. Holiness is the cleansing from sin. And so we get three key ideas: sin, cleansing from sin, and the result of holiness. To be in relationship with the holy God, the people must be holy also. Let's look at a couple of verses, and we might come back to these later on. But if you have your Bibles, turn to Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2. Leviticus 19, verse 2. Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. There's the central command. Be holy, for I, the Lord, am holy. God wanted his people to be holy because they were special. They were his people. And here's the key idea. To be in relationship with the holy God, we must be holy. Only that which is holy can be in the presence of the holy God. Let's look at chapter 11, verses 44 and 45. For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground. For I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. So that phrase, that statement, you shall be holy, for I am holy, used twice here. And so this statement is connected, at least in this passage, and it's repeated other times. It's connected to how the people should live. And in this case, they are not to defile themselves with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground. But there's always a connection. How the people act is related to their relationship with God. And God is holy. Therefore, he expected Israel to be different and to follow his law. And then 20, verse 6. Leviticus 20, verse 6. If a person turns to mediums and wizards, whoring after them, I will set my face against that person and will cut him off from among his people. No, that's the wrong verse. Sorry. 26. That doesn't sound right. You shall, 26. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you shall be mine. So there's a key idea added here, and that is that the people needed to be separated. That's one of the definitions of holiness, is to be separated. There are different degrees of holiness that are talked about, and we mentioned that a couple weeks ago. The closer one gets to the Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant, the holier one must be. So the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant, that is the key, or that is the central place of God's presence among his people. If something was unholy, it needed to be outside the camp. The closer something came to that Holy of Holies, the more it must be holy. So there's degrees of holiness. We'll talk some more about holiness as we go along, but just keep in mind this theme of holiness. And what does Leviticus teach us about holiness? There are 6 major divisions or parts to Leviticus. There we go. In chapters 1 through 7, there are regulations for making sacrifices. And there's different types of sacrifices. We'll go over those in a minute. I have a list of them. But there's the types of offerings are listed in chapters 4 to 5. There's the burnt whole offering. The burnt whole offering, the whole animal was burnt, was burned up. And that was a sign of dedication. There were cereal and grain offerings, peace or fellowship offerings. That was to reestablish fellowship. There was sin offerings or purification, reparation or guilt offerings. So that word reparation means compensation, that a restitution. That's where if you do something to cause someone harm, then you need to pay them back. So there are laws about that, sacrifices. And the purpose of all of these were to atone for accidental or ignorant sins. And we'll have to think about that one a little bit. These were not intentional sins, because intentional sins were treated very seriously, and most of them had the death penalty. There was no forgiveness if you, on purpose, went out and broke a law. But if it was accidental or you didn't realize what you were doing, then there was, you can make atonement through these sacrifices. The next major part, chapters 8 through 10, talks about the ordination of Aaron, and the first sacrifice is at the tabernacle. The next part are laws of ritual purity. And that talks about, skin diseases and blood and that kind of thing, skin rashes. And then in chapter 16, we have the liturgy and the calendar for the Day of Atonement, which was the most important day of the year for the Jews. Laws for holy living. So chapter 17 through 26 is known as the Holiness Code. And that's where we have a lot of laws that are very specific. A lot of them don't apply to us, but we have to figure out what is the timeless truth behind them. And we'll do a little practice with that. And then chapter 27 is laws on tithes and offerings. That gives you kind of an overview of the whole book. The main messages of Leviticus. Number one is the holiness of God. God is holy, obviously, but because God is holy, anything associated with God also must be holy. That will have significant impact on how the people were to live. So the holiness of God. What does Leviticus teach us about God? And let me just comment about this also. Remember or think in your mind or ask this question: how much did the people of Israel know about God at this point in their existence? Not very much, really. They knew a little bit from the stories of the patriarchs described in Genesis. So those stories were passed down. Genesis tells us a lot about God, but it's still kind of limited. They knew a little bit because of the Exodus, and they've seen the miracles, but they did not have a lot of understanding of who God was, deep understanding. The book of Leviticus and all of the events and descriptions of the law and the worship, all of that was to help them understand God's nature. So we see a couple of important things about God in Leviticus. We see obviously his holiness, but we also see his grace, that God was forgiving of his people, that God made a way for them to be forgiven of their sins. So we see holiness and love and compassion. The book of Deuteronomy will help us understand God's love even more. And then we see also the justice of God. God does not let sin go unpunished. People will be held accountable for their actions. So God puts people on the same level. No one gets special privileges. You cannot go and pay a lawyer to get you off, which a lot of people do today. If you have a lot of money, you can basically walk free in some places because you can hire yourself a good lawyer. So the justice of God. And this would make the whole nation of Israel be a just and fair nation. A third important topic is sin and the need for atonement. Leviticus takes the idea of sin seriously. If we do not think about sin, then we make light of what salvation is. And then a fourth important theme is that this book gives us important background for Christ's sacrifice on the cross. There's so much in Leviticus that points towards the need of the cross and what Jesus has done for us. That's why in the New Testament, the writers of the New Testament say that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. And part of that's talking about here in Leviticus. Jesus is the perfect sacrifice for sin. And the epistle to the Hebrews is very helpful for us in that regard. All right, so we can look for these main ideas and themes in the book of Leviticus. Let's look a little bit more at the theology of this book. The theology. First of all, law in ancient Israel. Here are a couple of technical terms for you. You might not know these terms or ever hear of them before, but these are technical terms to describe two forms of laws that we will read in Leviticus. The first type is called apodictic. Apodictic. This is a form of law in the form of thou shalt not. It uses the second person. So we see this type of law, for example, in the Ten Commandments. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not covet. You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. So these are those thou shalt nots, if you use the old King James English. These other type of law is called casuistic. Casuistic. So these are technical terms. I would not worry about them, but just remember what they represent. And this type of law is called a case-by-case situation law. And this type of law it would be something like this. When a man, and then it tells a little bit of situation, like, for example, if someone has a bloody discharge, then they need to be purified. Okay. If a man digs a hole and his neighbor's ox falls into it, then he shall pay his neighbor with his own ox. So these use the third person. These are more like a little story or a condition. We see both of these kinds of laws here in Leviticus. We saw some back already in Exodus. And so two different types of laws. There are some distinctive features to Israel's law code. First of all, monotheism. God is the authority, not a king. In fact, Israel's kings had to come under the law themselves. No one was above the law. God was the author, not any human. There was another law code in the ancient world. It was called the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi, let's see, what nation was he part of? I'm thinking he was Hittite or something like that. He was one of the other ancient Near East places. And this code, Code of Hammurabi, has actually been discovered. Let's just look that up here real quick on the internet. This is quite fascinating. So let's just look this up. The Code of Hammurabi. See if I can spell it right. Code of okay, there it is, Hammurabi. So you can actually see pictures of it. This is an ancient code that was dug up. Okay, so let me go back to Code of Hammurabi, Babylonian. Legal text, just a little bit before the time of Moses and Israel. It's the longest, best organized, best preserved legal text from the ancient Near East. It is written in Old Babylonian dialect of Akkadian, purported by Hammurabi, the sixth king of the first dynasty of Babylon. So this is an ancient law code. It has some similarities to Israel's law, but it tends to be a lot harsher. For example, if someone, instead of an eye for an eye, it could be a life for an eye. You know, the punishment was a little harsher. But this was a famous law code that was discovered by archaeologists. But anyway, that was a law that was established by Hammurabi. That's different than what we have in Leviticus and in the Bible. This law came from God. So monotheism, one God, and this God has given the law. Another important distinctive feature of Israel's law code is that it was a combination of civil and religious law. In some countries today, the political part of the law is separate from the religious law. For example, the Philippines, the United States, government and religion are separate. There's laws for the government, and then the church can do its own laws. Well, not in ancient Israel. In Israel, both of them are together. There was no separation between government and church. For Israel, it was all one. So civil and religious law go together. They're one. Letter C. Somehow these got off. My outline is not too good. Anyway, a third characteristic. Now, all these things. Microsoft Word does funny things when it comes to making outlines. A higher value is placed on human life. A higher value is placed on human life. For Israel, the life of a person was taken seriously. And so if you happened to kill someone, that was taken seriously. There was no getting off free in that, or going to prison for a year or two. If you killed someone, you're going to be killed yourself. And so human life was important to them. And so that whole lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, that is one of the important contributions of Israel's law. And many nations today build their law code on on what we see here in the Bible. Letter D, everyone is included in this law code. The rich, the poor, the powerful, the underprivileged, everyone was included. Letter E, there was a high view of people with limited penalties. There was no, for example, if you did some something small to your neighbor, that neighbor could not demand your life. There was no brutality or abuse. The punishment was limited, in other words. There was still punishment, but the crime or the punishment was equal to the crime. Letter F, a heightening or an increase of moral sense between the sexes. And so the law, for example, protected marriage. And there was more of a person could not just go out and rape anyone they wanted. And so sexuality is carefully defined in Leviticus. And I think we could do a lot in our day by going back and rereading that part, because our world is so mixed up today about sexuality. Well, the book of Leviticus was helping ancient Israel be clear about that. Morality was linked to religion. How the people lived and acted was connected to their worship of God. There are some people today who are very individualistic. It's like, I can do whatever I want. I believe in God. Yes, that's my religion. But then I can go and live any way I want. Not for Israel. How they lived was connected to their worship of God. You couldn't say you believe one thing and go live out another. You could not do that. There was also a concern for community, for families, for social structure. And then letter I, the law is the expression of God's claim to lordship. God is supreme, and the law tells us and shows us how God is the supreme Lord. The purpose of the law. This should be number 3. I have to go back and edit these notes better. Then I'll be posting. You can find this on our field website, but I'll go back and fix them at some point. These things just are all messed up. The purpose of the law is to show the people how to be holy in order to worship a holy God. There's the central idea. The law shows the people how to be holy and to worship a holy God. Then under this idea, first of all, the law is related to creation. If the people did not obey the law, then creation would be a problem for them. The land would not bear fruit. There would be all kinds of problems for them. Creation would reject them if they did not keep God's law. But if they obeyed God's law, then creation would be a blessing. God's created order. Go back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, especially chapter 1. God created the world with order. Everything had a purpose. And sin comes along and messes it all up. The law helps the human race go back to Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, which focuses upon the marriage relationship. God redeemed Israel, and Israel could join in God's purpose for creation if they would obey the law. So the law is closely related to creation. Letter B, the law should be interpreted in dynamic terms as part of God's relationship with his people. So just think of this. The key word here is relationship. The law is all about relationship with God and also relationship with one another. The law really is summarized in, as Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor. That's what we'll find in the book of Leviticus. How do we show we love God? How do we show we love our neighbor? Letter C, the law is a gift of God's grace, and so it is not a burden. For some people, they look at the law and they think, oh, it's like you put a heavy load on me. I just cannot follow it. I cannot keep the law. It's just so heavy. No one can ever keep the law. And we get depressed. Well, go read Psalm 19 or Psalm 119. In those passages, the law is a wonderful gift, and it shows us how to live. So we need to think as Christians that the law is a gift of God's grace to us. Letter D, the law is a response to all that God has done. How do we respond to God's grace? We do it by faith and obedience. So remember these three things when it comes to the Bible: grace, faith, obedience. It's those three are from Genesis chapter 1 all the way to Revelation chapter 22. God's grace towards us, we believe in God, and we show that by how we live. So the law is, and obedience to the law is our response to what God has done. Letter E, the law is given to those who have already been redeemed. So it is not a means to be redeemed. And this is where some of the Jews during Jesus' day had it backwards. They thought if they obeyed the law, then they would be considered righteous. And Paul the Apostle says, no, you cannot be justified by works of the law. Works of the law come as a result of God's grace and salvation in our life. So these laws do not tell Israel how to be saved. These laws tell Israel how to live as God's chosen people. So remember that order, really important. God saved the people from Egyptian slavery, the Exodus. God redeemed his people. God saved them. Now, this is how they live as saved people. And that same pattern is true also for us as Christians. We are saved through God's grace and through Jesus Christ. Then we respond to God's grace and salvation by living in obedience. We walk the walk of faith. And then letter F. Obedience is a reaction to what God has done and not in response to any ethical demand. Okay? So this is basically what I just said. Our obedience, just like Israel, is a response to God's grace. So let me just put here, just in the notes, grace first. First comes grace. Second, response of faith. Third, Faith is lived out by obedience. Now for Israel, the grace was seen through the Exodus. God's salvation through the Exodus. Oh, type. The response of faith, have no other gods except the Lord God. And obedience, follow God's laws. So that's the sequence that we will see throughout the whole Bible. Oh, I don't know why this is. Sometimes Microsoft Word gives these funny codes that you don't know what's going on here. But I'm not going to take time to edit all this. It's just all messed up. Needless to say, I'm not always impressed with Microsoft Word. All right. The nature of sin. Let's think about that also. The nature of sin. What are some evidences of the fall thus far in the Pentateuch? What do you think? Let me ask you. You can just unmute yourself. What proof or example of sin do we see so far in the Pentateuch? What evidence of sin do we have so far? What do you think? What examples?
Disobedience.
Yeah, what? What example?
Like, for example, we're always promises. We're always asking forgiveness, but we're always sinning.
Yeah, but how about in the Pentateuch so far? Genesis and Exodus. Where do you see sin? Example of sin.
Genesis to Exodus.
You remember any stories?
Wait.
Dr. David.
Yeah, go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the story when they were in the wilderness.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, where they created Baal. Yeah.
These people are just
stubborn, I should say.
Stubborn.
Yeah.
That's a good word for it. Good English word. Stubborn. They have hard hearts. They won't listen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So these people of Israel, at the heart of sin lies disobedience. The people will just not listen to God. Sin is a concrete concept in the Old Testament. In other words, it's not abstract. It's not something that we just have in our head, but it's actually something that we do. People live it out. There's something personal about it. As individuals, people sin. And then as a group, we see how Israel as a whole nation also sin. So it's not really like some little thing that's growing inside of us, but it's more of a moral condition. There's something missing in us. There's some kind of, it's almost like a disease, but it's not really physical. There's just something lacking. So in the Old Testament, sin is something that people do. It's an action. sin as a condition. So thinking about sin now, sin is a corruption of human nature. Adam and Eve were created in the image of God. Adam, if we go back to Genesis chapter 5, verse 3, and as we do that, remember that all these books should be read together, not separately. So Genesis 5:3, when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. So Adam was created in God's image, and everyone who followed after Adam, we bear something about Adam's image in us. Adam's image was deprived of fellowship with God. It was deprived. It was missing the purity. And so sin is a corruption of human nature. This is not how God created the human race. It is not God's plan. It is a corruption. It is a, what's another word for corruption? It is a perversion, depravity. It is an imitation. So I like the word perversion. It's not God's plan. Sin is a condition of seeking to be one's own God. We want to be God. And sin is inherited. It is a racial problem. Go back to Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And then chapter 8, verse 21. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. So we have inherited this racial problem. And there's something about our human heart that is depraved. So we get sin as a condition. Theologians would call that original sin. Then we have sin as an action. There's a lot of different terms for sin in the Old Testament. And we won't look at those at this point in this class. But there's a lot of different words that are used for what we would call sin: rebellion, corruption, defilement, and then there's lots of different Hebrew words.
Dr. David?
Yes.
Yeah, just a thought and a question. Because I grew up understanding that we are a sinner by nature. But then on this point, it seems that we are corrupted, by sin. How I'm just putting that together. It seems that in this lesson that we are learning right now, we are by nature an image of God, and we are corrupted by sin.
Yeah. So the question becomes, what happens to sin?
Yeah, exactly. That's
so that's kind of the complex question that theologians wrestle with a little bit, and we can go to the New Testament to help us with that some. And so from a theological perspective, we would say that sin as a condition, we experience. Well, let's go to sin as an action first. Sin as an action is forgiven. We're forgiven of our past, but we still have this corruption within us. Now, this corruption, there's two parts to it. or at least that I'm thinking about. There's this spiritual, oh, let me back up a little bit. The theologians have approached this. Are you still there? It looks like the internet stopped for a moment. Okay, I think it's still going.
Yep.
Okay. Theologians talk about this in kind of two ways, at least Wesleyan holiness. Kind of the older way is called substantival, where sin is kind of a thing that is cleansed out. And then kind of a different approach is sin is relational. Sin is not a thing, but it's a broken relationship. Well, I think we see both of those ideas in the Bible. So I just say that as a preface. So we're dealing with the topic of original sin. There's one aspect of original sin that we just always have to deal with. And that it is kind of a physical aspect. And what I mean by that is we have to deal with death. And death is the consequence of sin. And death shows up in human weakness. Okay, we are weak as human beings. We are physically weak. That means that my thinking is not always the best. My attitude, my response to people, because I'm a finite human being. And as a child of Adam, you know, I'm as long as I'm in this world, I'm going to have to deal with my weak human condition. And that human condition means that sometimes I fail miserably. And also, sometimes if I'm weak, I give in to temptation, and that results in sins of action. So that part of us, we will not get rid of until resurrection, until we die. So we have to deal with our weakened human condition. And so something happened to Adam and Eve when they ate of that forbidden fruit. Okay, something physical happened to them. They had pain, they had sorrow, they had birth pains. They had to go out and work hard, toil hard, physically. So that part. But there's also a spiritual part to it. And that's what we might call like a moral part to it. And that's really our relationship with God and our ability to love. And that part of the image of God is being restored, little by little. 2 Corinthians 3:18, we are being remade into his likeness from one degree of glory to the next. So theologians talk about that part of the human condition. So we call that part original sin. This physical part, that's more of the result of sin, but we're not guilty for being human. God's grace will help us through our humanness, but on this other part, that's the part that is corrupted and leads to the sins of action. And I think that's the part that these passages especially talk about. And that part, the Bible will talk about the cleansing of sin, the removal of sin. And it's not really a thing within us. It's not like our broken genetics. Okay, that's what I talked about on this side. If you see my hands, this side, our broken genetics. No, there's something deeper than that. We're talking about a broken heart, a broken mind, a broken internal part of us, our attitude, all of our thinking, that's corrupted and broken. So some parts in the Bible talks about the human heart. Some parts talk about the mind. Different descriptions. It's all kind of this similar in my thinking. So that part of us can be changed little by little as we commit ourselves more and more. And that's what we call the sanctification process. And so sin is a condition. In one way, we have to deal with it our whole life because we're weak and human, and we just cannot think the way we should. But on the other hand, there's a moral aspect to it, our relationship with God that can improve with God's grace. Now, someday, when this physical part is done and we're resurrected, temptations will be gone, our weak thinking will be gone, we will be transformed, we will see him as he is, our vision will be clear, our understanding will be clear, and this part of us is done, gone away. And that's why we as Christians look forward to resurrection. And this old corrupted existence is gone, and what started here on earth, salvation that we're experiencing now, growing little by little as we grow closer to God day by day, that will be our existence. So it will be a total reversal of this condition of Adam. So that's just a little bit of theology. I hope that makes sense a little bit. So theologians. So some of the Calvinists, they will say, well, we never really get over this. In my thinking, Calvinism goes back to Augustine, who I'm talking about my left and right hand here. So this hand, remember, this is our broken genetics. Just think of it that way. Our weak physical. Well, Augustine said some of that's because of sin. And so Calvinism comes out of that. So as long as we're in this human world, we're going to every day in word, thought, and deed, we commit sin. Why? Because we're human. Well, from a Wesleyan perspective, at least in my interpretation, we separate these things. So that just because I'm human doesn't mean I have to sin. Now, I'm weak and I will sin, but then on this side of it, I ask God for forgiveness and cleansing, and I can keep growing. So maybe I'm oversimplifying it, and I should ask the theologians, but I just kind of see this difference theologically. And I think the Calvinists go a little bit too far this way because of Augustine. Augustine and Calvinism, they're kind of the same camp. And anyway, those things are outside my expertise. That's just kind of, I would have to ask a theologian if my interpretation is correct. Thank you. But anyway, so this sin is a condition. We can improve it through God's grace, and we can overcome our corrupt human nature little by little with God's grace. We're being transformed into Christ likeness. Our thinking is changed. Romans 12:1. We are given a new way of thinking. Romans 12:1 and 2. We're being transformed, and we're taking in the mind of Christ more and more day by day. And so what is being changed? It's this corruption. So as believers, we believe that Jesus, what he did on the cross, overcomes this problem too. And this is all, the foundation for all of this is in the Old Testament. The more we study the Old Testament, the more we will understand this. So when we come to the New Testament, then we see, oh, this makes so much more sense to me. Once we begin looking at the Old Testament, then we come to the New Testament, then we understand our Christian theology more. That's why it's important for us to study this in the Old Testament. Now, it's not easy. It's very complex and difficult. But if we look at the big topics, the big theology, then we come to the New Testament. It will make better sense. So we have sin as action. The main root of sin is unbelief, not believing in God. It's a lack of faith. Sins of action replaces God's will with human will. I want to do it my way. God's law is not important enough for me to obey. Why? Because I don't fear God. So that's why in the Old Testament, at the center of the law was the fear of God. And we'll read about a few stories here tonight, or at least I might mention them. Especially, I came across one that was chapter 10, the death of Nadab and Abihu. That put some fear into, these two fellows, Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, they did not follow God's law. They did it their own way. And so chapter 10, verse 1, it says, now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer. That's where they put the incense, and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized, in my translation, fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. So these two sons of Aaron did it their way. They did it their own way, their human will. What happened to them? And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. So that would put some fear. If I was a priest and I saw what happened, I would say, I'm going to do this very carefully. I'm going to do exactly what God says. I don't want to lose my life either. So here's the problem with sin. We do it our way. Righteousness defines sin. Sin is dependent upon how we understand righteousness. If we know what righteousness is, then we will know what sin is. If we do not know what is righteous, then we will not know what sin is. So Paul the Apostle, he says that the law defines sin. If I would not know what sin is unless the law tells me what it is. Romans chapter 7. Well, the same idea. God's righteousness and what he tells us in the law tells us what sin is. And then sins of ignorance. This is used most often in the context of ritual law. One Old Testament scholar calls these sins of frailty. Sins because we're human. We make bad choices. We just cannot think right. So Leviticus 4, chapter 4, verse 2. Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if anyone sins unintentionally, and my Bible has a footnote, or by mistake, in any of the Lord's commandments about things not to be done, and does any one of them, then there's a sacrifice they could do. Chapter 5, verse 14. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if anyone commits a breach of faith and sins unintentionally, or sins by mistake, then they could make atonement. And then 22, verse 14. And if anyone eats of a holy thing unintentionally, he shall add, and then those are those conditional, casuistic kind of laws that I talked about up here in the notes. So if a person does this, then this is what they can do. Okay, so sins of that as action. Sin is described in the Old Testament by what has been lost, by what has been cut off. So some kind of consequence. The person is cut off from the people. They have to go live outside the camp or something. And then another point here is the ceremonial law. Should be number 5 if it works. Number 5, the ceremonial law. This is under the general heading of theology. The ceremonial law describes how the people were to worship, what kind of actions they were to do, and sacrifices and so on. So this ceremonial law is called the cult. The sequence: redemption and then worship. God's act, human response. In today's terms, we would say God's grace and salvation, and then our response of worship. So how did they worship? Offering the redeemed soul to God for his service. The people would commit themselves, and dedication of oneself to the ethical behavior which the covenant demanded. So the people worshiped by giving themselves. And this was symbolized, as we'll see here in the next part, it was symbolized by the whole burnt offering. They would give a whole offering. Everything was given to God. And then a final important theological statement here is that the law was preparation for Christ. So a little bit of the theology. That I can only just like mention these right now. We could spend a lot of time just thinking about sin and the law. But when you take the doctrine of holiness class, you can come back here to Leviticus, and think about what is going on here, and how do I understand holiness and sin? And Leviticus will help you. Leviticus is important for the doctrine of holiness. Well, let's move on to another major area of Leviticus study of theology, and that is the sacrificial system. Now, this is a big area, and it's easy to get lost in the details. So try not to get lost in the details. And I was rereading this, and it's just like, oh, this is really exciting. They're supposed to go do this and offer this part of the animal and take the rest of it outside the camp. And it just goes on and on. So it's not a real exciting part of the Bible to read. I'll be honest with you. But there's some important things for us to try to understand about these chapters. The context. Remember that the sacrificial system was central. The sacrificial system was central to the faith of Israel. And that is suggested by the place of Leviticus. Leviticus is it's way up here in the front. Right after Exodus, then comes this. So that tells us it was very important to their faith. The central duty of the priests also was the sacrifices. So we learn about the sacrifices before the priests were even ordained, before their consecration. So just the context within Leviticus tells us that the sacrifices were important. They're the first part of the book. And usually the first part is the most important part to pay attention to. So, number 2, the sacrifices were a recognition of what God had already done for the people through his mercy. The people were to worship through the sacrifices, and this was a response of faith. This is where, actually, by the time of the prophets later on in the Old Testament, this is where Israel had gone wrong. They thought that the sacrifices were their faith. But God said, no, I don't desire all these sacrifices. I desire a repentant, contrite heart. And you remember places like Hosea and Amos and Micah. Those prophets talk about how what God really wanted was a repentant heart. He wanted faith, not the sacrifices. The sacrifices were to guide their faith. The sacrifices were to be a response of faith. And Israel later on had it backwards. And that's why the prophets came along and told them to go back to faith. The sacrifices were not magical. There was nothing magical about them. The people could not like go and do these sacrifices and somehow God was obligated to obey, to do something. No, that's wrong thinking. Many had missed this in Israel, and they thought, oh, if I do this and this, I do offer this kind of sacrifice, God will forgive me and I'm good to go. No, there's nothing magical about them. God provides the rituals and the means for forgiveness. Forgiveness is granted by God as an act of free grace and not human merit. When Paul the Apostle said that we are saved by grace through faith and not by works, he got that from reading the Old Testament. That's what this is all about. The people were not saved by the sacrifices. They were saved by God's grace. So remember that point. Some people think the Old Testament was different. The Old Testament was not different. We have the same theology in the Old Testament as in the New Testament. The Christians did not invent a new doctrine. Paul did not come up with a new doctrine in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. He was correcting the false understanding of the Jews. And he says that the way that this happens now, the way of free grace is through Christ. And that's how God offers forgiveness. Because Jesus is our Passover lamb. He is the one who made atonement for us. So the book of Romans, and when Paul talks about in chapter 3, I'll just turn over there real quick. We'll do a little bit of New Testament theology here real quick, just to show you how important this is. And I hope it helps make more sense of the New Testament. Romans chapter 3, verse 23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We are corrupted. We are broken and are justified by his grace. Okay, so we are made right with God by the grace. And how does this grace come? Through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as, and so this English translation has propitiation. I wish they would change that word. So he was put forward as the means of atonement by his blood to be received by faith. So now Jesus, flip back to Leviticus, Jesus is this fulfillment of all these sacrifices. And by his blood, not the blood of all these bulls and goats and lambs and all this other things, not by those, but by his blood. This is to show God's righteousness, his justice, because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. This is the English Standard Version, and it's really complex English. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. But anyway, well, that passage in Romans makes better sense if we go back to Leviticus and understand this very point here. Confession and repentance were to accompany the giving of sacrifices. Look at Leviticus chapter 5, verses 5 and 6. When he realizes his guilt in any of these and confesses the sin he has committed, he shall bring to the Lord as his compensation for the sin that he has committed, a female from the flock, and so on. So when a person back then was giving a sacrifice, they were to confess their sin. And then chapter 16, verse 21. Chapter 16, verse 21. And Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions, all their sins. So this is the Day of Atonement. So Aaron, as the high priest, was to confess the sins of the people on the Day of Atonement. The sacrifices were sacraments and the means of grace. Today we have the Lord's Supper. Back then they had the sacrifices, and that's how they experienced God's grace. The sacrifices were a sign of faith. The amount of sacrifice was dependent upon one's wealth. So a wealthy person could give like an animal. But in some situations, so if a person was poor, they could give like a pigeon or a dove, which didn't cost very much. Okay, well, before we get into this next part, I think maybe this is a good time to take a break.
Ito ang gusto ko dito eh. Take a break.
The sacrificial system of Israel. There are two major kinds of sacrifices when it comes to the people of the Old Testament, Israel. First of all, there's the offerings for the laity. These would be for, the people. And then the other part are the offerings that the priests are to make for themselves or perhaps in behalf of others. So these are very similar. So we have the whole burnt offerings for both, a cereal offering, a peace offering. They're just in a little bit different order here. The purification offering, number 4 and number 3, and the reparation offering, number 5, and then that's in number 4. These offerings, sacrifices and offerings are the first 7 chapters of Leviticus. I found this chart that is helpful and is a good summary for us. It kind of makes it a little easier to understand. I think I got this off the internet. So the different kinds of offering, we have the burnt offering. This is a bull, ram, male goat, male dove, or young pigeon without blemish. These are always male animals. And so the different type of animal is dependent upon how much money a person has, their economic status. This is voluntary, signifies propitiation, atonement for sin, and complete surrender, devotion, and commitment to God. The burnt offering. So the whole animal is given. The grain offering, also called a meal or a tribute. This is flour, bread, or grain made with olive oil and salt, but it's always unleavened, or perhaps incense. It's voluntary, signifies thanksgiving for the first fruits. The sin offering, this is a male or female animal without blemish, and there's different ones that can be offered. A bull for the high priest and congregation, a male goat for the king, female goat or lamb for the common person, a dove or pigeon for a slightly poor person, and a tenth of an ephah of flour, which would be just, it's just like a couple of kilograms. So not a lot of flour for those who are really, really poor. And this was mandatory, made by the one who had sinned unintentionally or was unclean in order to attain purification. The guilt offering, this was a ram or a lamb without blemish. This was mandatory, made by a person who had either deprived another of his rights or had desecrated something holy. And then the peace offering, also called the fellowship offering. This was any animal without blemish. The species of the animal varied according to the individual's economic status. And this was voluntary. It symbolizes fellowship with God. It was used for thanksgiving, for a special blessing. It offers a ritual expression of a vow and symbolizes the general thankfulness to be brought to one of the 3 required religious services. So here's a simple summary, and I have a few notes here also that we'll look at. And then also in this chart are the feasts, the different feasts. So I stuck those in also. These are described also in Leviticus. The Passover begins the liturgical year for the people of Israel. Passover, the Hebrews called Pesach, signified the redemption of Israel. So we read about that in Exodus 12, and then it's repeated in all of these Pentateuch books. It's also the basis for the Last Supper in the Gospels. The Feast of Unleavened Bread. This signified the sanctification of the people of Israel. And we can read about that in Exodus, a little bit here also in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all talk about it. The Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Feast of First Fruits. The feast is no longer observed in Rabbinic Judaism, but this signified the resurrection of Israel as a free people. Also, the Feast of Weeks is observed today. So the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, the 50th day after Passover, also known as the Feast of Harvest. So that's described in the Pentateuch. The Feast of Trumpets, the beginning of the civil year. And this was signified the calling of Israel to judgment. That's in Leviticus and Numbers. The Day of Atonement, that takes a whole chapter in Leviticus. This was the most important day, the most important holiday for the people of Israel. And it signified the atonement that God provided for the sins of the people. And then the Feast of Tabernacles, also known as the Shelters of Booths, signified God's presence with his covenant people. And there's a very strong messianic sense to that, for looking to when the Son of God came and tabernacled or lived among the people. So a lot of passages here in the Pentateuch about the Feast of Tabernacles. So here's a brief reference to all of these different feasts. Well, okay, so let's look at a little bit another list of these feasts or these sacrifices. Each sacrifice had a different way of dealing with sin. And each sacrifice did something to restore the divine human relationship that was broken because of sin. The burnt offering. The only sacrifice, this was the only sacrifice where the entire animal was burned up. It was the most important sacrifice because it signified total dedication of the people. The people were to bring their best animal, the animal that was should have no imperfections about it. And there was allowance made for poor people because poor people could not afford animals. That'd be like us bringing a car to church and say, "Oh, here, you can have this car for today's offering." No, we don't do that. So, so the poor people could bring something that's much simpler. The purpose of this, chapter 1, verse 4. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. So it's atonement. Verse 9. Okay, so the entrails and legs should wash with water. The priest shall burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering, a food offering, with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So the animal was to be, sacrificed and parts of it washed, and then everything burned up. And verse 13, it was a food offering, pleasing aroma to the Lord, and so on. So this was to atone for sin, to pay a ransom for the penalty of sin, which would otherwise be death. Paul the Apostle said the wages of sin is death. Instead of paying with their life, the people could pay with the life of an animal. This offering restored the broken relationship the people had with God. The next one is called a cereal offering in chapter 2, also known as grain offering. This is the only one of the offerings that did not involve an animal, but it did take the fine flour. So I don't know if you've ever seen flour ground up. Maybe you've seen some of it, or maybe rice, but flour, to make the very fine flour took a lot of work, especially back then. They just had their stones that would grind the grain into flour. And then they'd have to sift the flour and make sure that what they had was the fine, the very beautiful flour. We take for granted the flour we get in the stores today, but back then they had to work hard at making it. So they would take just a small part of this and sacrifice it, and the rest of it would be given to the priest, and the priest would use it for their daily food. So this type of offering was a form of worship or tribute to God for God's provision and for his sovereignty. The peace offering. Most of the meat of the peace offering was kept by the worshiper, but certain parts were burnt or given to the priests. And both male and female animals were used with this offering. So this peace offering was an expression of thanksgiving, or as a free will offering. It is also called a fellowship offering, and recognize God as the source of true peace. The purification offering. This was a special use of animal blood to cleanse sacred items within the tabernacle, depending on how much, the degree of sin, how much sin was committed. Its purpose was to purify the stain of sin or uncleanness. And then the reparation offering. This consisted of a ram and silver. The blood was sprinkled, the fatty portions burned, and the rest of the animal was given to the priest. The purpose was to compensate God for wrongs committed against him. And then the other big offering we read about, and so these are described in the next chapters here, the different offerings. And then later in chapter 16, we have the Day of Atonement. Now, this was a really important one, as I said before a few minutes ago. There are three main parts to the Day of Atonement. The purification of the sanctuary. The high priest went into the Holy of Holies. His sins had to be atoned for first by the blood of a bull. The bull would have been the biggest animal they had. The blood was sprinkled on the cover of the ark and before the cover of the ark, and on various objects throughout the tabernacle. So the sanctuary itself was purified by blood. And then The second part was the sending away of the scapegoat. The priest confessed all the wickedness and rebellion of the Israelites and all their sins. Look at chapter 16, verse 21. And Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions and all their sins. And he shall put them on the head of the goat, symbolic, of course, and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who was in readiness. So this goat would symbolically take away the sins and the guilt of the people. And then the third part was the presentation of 2 burnt offerings. The high priest offered 2 rams, one for himself and one for the people, to make atonement. This was the way every year that the people would atone for their sins. Now, the book of Hebrews, interestingly, talks a lot about this, how the priest would have to do this every year over and over again. But Jesus made atonement one time forever. And by doing that, by his own blood, he opened the way to the Holy of Holies. It's hard to understand the epistle to the Hebrews without reading Leviticus, and especially chapter 16. If you study this part of the Old Testament, you go to the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, it will make better sense to you. The significance. So as I said, this was the most important day on Israel's calendar. The purpose of the sacrificial system. This is found in the book God, Man, and Salvation by Kaiser and Taylor. Number 1 was to teach the holiness of God. To worship God, one has to be free from the defilement of sin. And so by these sacrifices, the people removed sin from themselves, and were able to worship God. Holiness is understood as separation from sin and separation to God. The sacrificial system was the way that God taught the people how to stay in fellowship with him. God comes to his people with forgiveness and cleansing. The people come to God with confession of guilt, thanksgiving, and worship. The sacrificial system also enforces principles of health. Now, I haven't mentioned that yet, but Leviticus, some of these laws and rituals, they help the people understand more about common health. We take for granted today, but back then they did not understand, how diseases were spread, and they did not know how that germs, you could get germs very easily. I lost my place. Oh, here we go. Letter C, to preserve Israel's separation from paganism. So these sacrifices taught the people of Israel how to be different, that they were different, they were holy, they were not to be like the pagans. And then as a forward look to the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. This is all a preparation for Jesus, who is the fulfillment of the sacrificial system. Now, here's another important idea for us to think about. Turn to chapter 17, verse 11. This is one of the important verses that's hidden away in the Old Testament. There's a phrase here that's really quite important. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your sins. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life. So the life is in the blood of a person or an animal. the place of blood was important. You know, like we might read this and say, oh, that must have been a bloody mess. You know, all these sacrifices and blood sprinkled everywhere, not very sanitary. Well, if we think in modern terms, we're missing it. The blood represented the life of the animal. And later on, the blood of Jesus represented his life. Jesus gave his blood, he was giving his life. A key Hebrew word here is kippur. And you might recall the name of the Day of Atonement is called Yom Kippur. So kippur means to make atonement. The object is always sin. Sin is atoned for. The effect of the atonement is forgiveness. So blood is the life. Let's turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 23. Only be sure that you do not eat the blood, for the blood is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the flesh. So consistently throughout these laws, there'll be a statement that says that the people were not to eat the blood because the blood represented the animal, the life of the animal. In the New Testament, the book of Acts, chapter 15, the early Christians at the Jerusalem Council gave direction for the Gentiles that they should abstain from idolatry, immorality, food sacrifice to idols, idolatry, food or strangled animals, and blood. So the Jews, even into the first century, and the Christians, the first generation of Christians, taught the same thing. I was in Vietnam a couple of years ago, and the Christians in Vietnam, we went out for lunch one day. And during the class I was teaching, so we went out and had some of us ordered soup, really good soup, but there was this big chunk of red in there. And none of the Vietnamese Christians would eat that. So I didn't want to eat it either, to tell you the truth, but it was a chunk of blood. So everybody took it out and then they ate the soup. So even modern Christians, these are Nazarene Christians in Vietnam, they would not eat the blood. The blood represents the life. God himself atoned.
Doctor, we have a good food from blood.
Well, you know, that's one of those things where Paul the Apostle says in Romans 14, you can go read that chapter. Some people will eat this and some people will say that's not good. Well, just don't want to violate your brother or sister's conscience and cause them to stumble. So if you go to Vietnam and you go out to lunch with the Christians there, don't eat blood. But where you're at, you know, that's up to your conscience.
Yeah.
But for Israel, why did they say that? Because that blood was representing, you know, this life that was given. It was kind of like stealing from God, taking back the life that this person had given through the animal. It's kind of like saying, I want this back, God. So, you know, don't eat the blood because you've given the blood to God. You've given the life to God. You don't take back what you've given to God. So that might be part of it. Okay, so let's see. So the gift of animal blood was God's, let me start that phrase again. Animal blood was God's gift to the people so that they did not have to give their own blood. Because the wages of sin is death. They deserve to die. But instead of giving their own life, they gave the life of an animal. So that's why blood is the means by which atonement is made. All but the most heinous how do you say that? Heinous, which means atrocious, worse, terrible, dreadful, wicked, evil. Only the worst of sins could be all but the worst of sins could be forgiven or cleansed. Leviticus 6:7. And the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord, and he shall be forgiven for any of the things that one may do, and thereby become guilty. The sacrifices were God's offer for forgiveness. Okay, another important topic for us, the cultic system as preparation for Christ. And I have a lot of passages here that I don't want to take time to look through, but let's just go over this part briefly. The death of Jesus is interpreted in sacrificial terms in the New Testament. Jesus is called the Lamb of God, and that's the sacrificial lamb. The blood of Jesus is talked about many times throughout Acts, the epistles, Revelation. And Jesus is the sacrifice of atonement in that passage we read just a little while ago in Romans chapter 3. So the death of Jesus was the primary sacrifice of all time. The Old Testament background is essential knowledge for interpreting the book of Hebrews. Old Testament sacrifices were merely illustrations, or we could even say here, types or preparation for Jesus' sacrifice. The Old Testament sacrifices were inadequate to make one perfect. Jesus was the perfect offering, able to make us holy. And these are all references from Hebrews. The blood of Christ is able to make one pure and to remove guilt. Jesus is the perfect high priest, not in Aaron's line, but in the order of Melchizedek. He is holy, blameless, and pure. He serves in the heavenly tabernacle and purified it once and for all. He opened the way to the Holy of Holies for us. He is the supreme mediator. Another important part where Jesus is talked. Leviticus prepares for Jesus is the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is participation in Christ's sacrificial death. As we partake of the bread and the communion juice, we are remembering and participating in the sacrifice that Jesus made. The early church viewed the temple sacrifices as irrelevant. They're not important anymore. Don't need them. And indeed, just a few years after some of this New Testament was written, in the year 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. And that ended the sacrificial system of Israel. Well, another big part of Leviticus, I'm trying to move on here, is holiness and purity. The purity laws that will come next after some of this. Law beginning around chapter 11. Talk about what animals can be eaten and what should be avoided, and other laws of purity. So the distinction is made in Leviticus between holy and profane, clean and unclean. The issue is one of boundary. Now put on your sociologist hat for a moment, okay? Or you could also use the word anthropologist. So put on your sociologist hat. In every group, there is a boundary that defines who is in and who is out. Who's outside. We have this with all of our churches too. Now we try to make that border not so, what we want, we make it welcoming, but still we have our laws, our ethics, our morality that defines who a Christian is and how they should live. Well, for Israel, these laws of purity were the border around them. It defined who they were as a people. It involved what they ate, their foods, their actions, their times, the places, the objects of the tabernacle, morality, just about every part of their life somehow touched upon this idea of purity. The laws of purity affected the holiness of the community. These were like protections, okay, or definitions. What does it mean to be holy? What does it look like? How do we live? So these laws set up a boundary of what is considered clean or pure. And if you stepped out of those, then you were impure or unholy. If you were unholy or unclean or impure, then you had to go through cleansing. And so some of these laws will describe in quite detail how the people could go through cleansing. Sometimes, for example, if they had some kind of skin disease, they would have to be under isolation for a week. Now, we know all about that now. A year ago, I had no appreciation for this. It was just kind of foreign to me. Now, what do we have to do? We travel someplace, and what do we have to do? Isolation, 10 days, 14 days, or whatever. We have to be in quarantine. And many of you are going through quarantine right now.
Yeah.
So we know all about this now. Well, back then they had a week of quarantine.
Yes.
And check if the rash went away. If it didn't go away, then maybe another 7 days. And if it didn't go away, it was probably a chronic rash of some type. So they had all these different laws. And a lot of these actually, when you think about it, they were good for health reasons. You don't want someone with a contagious rash going all over the camp so that everyone gets it. And, for example, if you have mold in your house, you need to shut up the house and take everything out. So see if the mold will die. If it doesn't die, tear down the house, get rid of the mold. Now, some of these laws seem a little harsh for us from a modern perspective. But we have to put instead of reading this from our perspective, read it from the perspective of the ancient world. Purification and sanctification are divine acts mediated by the priests. The priests would declare someone clean. Not all impurity is sinful. For example, sex and death. We could add childbirth, monthly periods. Those are not sin. That's part of being human. But they were still things that needed to be cleansed, but they were not sinful. The purpose, let's turn to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 5, verse 33. You shall walk in all the way that the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live and that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land that you shall possess. There's the purpose, was to help the people live a good life in the land. If they disobeyed even these purity laws, their life would be miserable. They would be sick. They would be disobeying God. And so these laws would help them have a good life in the land. Another big theme in Leviticus is holiness. Holiness is defined by God. One author who wrote about the Pentateuch, Alexander, he gives these 4 aspects of holiness in Leviticus. First of all, holiness is God's character. To be holy is to be like God. Holiness in humans shows us to be pure, perfect, unblemished, or whole. We are who God created us to be. That's what holiness is for humans. Our holiness is always defined in relationship to God. Number 2, God is the sole source of holiness. Things are only holy as they are in relationship to God. Letter C. Holiness describes the moral perfection and purity of God's nature. Humans are to live in reflection of the moral perfection of God. So God's holiness shows up in love, purity, and righteousness. And these are the same qualities that we need to have: love, purity, and righteousness. So these are what God was teaching the people through these laws. He was teaching them what holiness was in very vivid ways. And then sanctification. That word, it comes from the same word in the original Hebrew. Sanctification is the process by which someone or something becomes holy. It is the result of divine activity. Let's look at a couple of these verses. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 8. Keep my statutes and do them. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. 21, verse 8. You shall sanctify him, for he offers the bread of your God. He shall be holy to you, for I, the Lord, who sanctify you, am holy. Verse 15. That he may not profane his offspring among his people, for I am the Lord who sanctifies him. And so just those other verses will describe, it's talking about the holiness in the priests. So God is the one who sanctifies. We can present ourselves to God, but it's God who sanctifies us. He's the one who makes us holy. We offer, he makes holy. Some key words when it comes to holiness. The first one is kadosh, which means holy. This occurs 252 times in Leviticus. 252, that's a lot. I mean, that's every few verses we get the word holy. You get the idea that this is the main topic of this book, holy. Tehor is another word that means clean, and that occurs 74 times. And then tameh is unclean, and that occurs 132 times. Unclean is something that is opposite of God's will and opposite of God's holiness. So there's 2 forms of uncleanness. There's the uncleanness as part of being human, for example, bodily discharges, rashes, that kind of stuff, just because we're human. And then there's the uncleanness that humans have the power to control, and that's breaking the law. We have the power to control our obedience. We often have no control whether we get a rash or bleeding or whatever. That's just part of life. There were degrees of holiness. The closer one was to the Holy of Holies, the holier one was. The holiest place in the camp was the Holy of Holies. The uncleanest place was outside the camp. If something or someone was unclean, they had to be taken outside of the camp. There are three categories of holiness. The tabernacle, the priests were holy. The camp and the Israelites were clean. And then outside the camp and non-Israelites were unclean. And each of these categories had degrees of holiness. There were degrees of uncleanness. The strength or weakness of an impurity was judged by its ability to communicate impurity to other objects or persons. So if something could cause something else to become unclean, then that was taken very seriously. For example, if someone had some kind of sickness or disease that could spread, that was taken quite seriously. Differing degrees of impurity were reflected by the way in which they polluted the sanctuary. Leviticus distinguishes between these impurities that could be rectified, which means, that's a word that means solved, corrected, repaired. That could be repaired, and those that could not be. There are some things that could not be made clean again. For example, something that was permanently unclean. The process for purifying uncleanness depended upon its seriousness. The normal process was the passage of time. For example, 7 days isolation. Or a person could wash or launder, for example, impure clothes. The amount depended on the degree of impurity. And then finally, the design of holiness. These actions and activities here in the book of Leviticus was to teach the people to be separated from their neighbors. They were to be different than the Canaanites and all the other people. And what would make them different is how they dressed, how they lived, what they ate, how they treated their bodies. All of these things would make them different than the people around them. We can think about that today as well. Should there be should we as Christians live differently than the culture around us? Should we dress differently? Well, maybe we need to dress modestly and not in revealing ways. Should we eat differently? I think that would help a lot of Christians if they didn't eat all the fattening foods and all that good stuff. We'd probably have less strokes and heart problems. So maybe we should eat differently. You know, we don't drink alcohol or those things that are bad for our body. We don't smoke, do drugs. So we treat our bodies differently. How about the places we live and our actions? Well, there's certain places we don't go and certain things we don't do. In the Church of the Nazarene, we have our special rules in the manual that try to do similar to what Leviticus did in the Old Testament. It tries to set up a boundary around what it means to be a Nazarene and a Christian. So those are guidelines. They're not a heavy burden. When I was growing up as a kid, I thought these were heavy burdens. You know, oh, I can't do this, I can't do that. You know, can't go to movies, can't go to dances and all this. And so I grew up thinking that the law was a heavy burden on me. Later on, did I come to realize that those were actually protections of me. So it's a separation from the neighbors as God's own people. There's no room for compromise. The people could not be holy one day and then go out and do what they wanted and sin the next. No, they were holy, they were consecrated, they were sanctified. To be holy was a constant struggle for Israel, both from external and internal impurity. They struggled throughout the Old Testament. And the answer only came in Jesus Christ. Now, to some degree, we still struggle with impurity. But what do? We agree with Paul the Apostle in Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live in impurity, but it is Christ who lives in me, giving me the power to overcome these things. He makes me pure. And letter D, to be holy was the prime mission of Israel, for it allowed Israel to be in relationship with God. Their primary calling. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 19. I read this before, but now it'll make better sense to us. Exodus chapter 19, verse 5. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, and that includes these laws that God gave, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests. The whole nation would be sanctified to God as priests, and a holy nation. So they were to be set aside. And how would this happen? By their obedience. These are the words you shall speak to the people of Israel. Israel's primary calling was to be holy. Their holiness was a divine act and human response. There's one more thing I want to do real quick. I then want to see if you guys have some questions or observations you'd like to make on Leviticus. Okay, I'm thinking of in the Holiness Code, chapter 19 and following. Yeah, that's okay. I think we've covered it quite a bit. So, do you have any questions or comments, observations? What do you think of Leviticus? Is it making better sense to you now? Understanding the kind of the key ideas of it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, Doc.
It's a better idea, better chapter.
It's not an easy book to figure out, but when you get these big ideas, then you go back and read it, it'll help.
Yes.
Doc, if I read this when going back to 14 years old, this is really a burden. Because I grew up that all the inside the Bible is preventing me to live my life, something like that. But right now when we slowly understand the context of it, this is really a protection to all of us.
Yeah, that's right. And so as Christians today, we follow God's law, not out of obligation or legalism, but we follow God's laws because we know that will protect us and keep us safe. It will show us God's will. It will help us be his holy people. And so we show that we love God by our obedience. God has given us laws in Scripture to help us to be his people in this world. Yeah. All right. Well, we've got a little bit of time left. Let's see. We could try to start the book of Numbers. Yeah, let's go ahead. It's Deuteronomy. Let's do at least a little bit of book of Numbers, and then we'll call it a day. the book of Numbers. Okay, the name Numbers in English comes from the Latin numeri, which comes from the Greek arithmoi. We get the word arithmetic from that. The Hebrew word is actually, for the book, is called the midbar. Midbar in Hebrew means wilderness. And the preface before that means in. So this is the fifth word of the book. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness. So the name in Hebrew means in the wilderness. So that's the name of this book, In the Wilderness. So it's kind of interesting to think about all that. The book really, I'm not sure where the Numbers name came from, probably from the first chapter because it lists a lot of numbers. And there are quite a few numbers later on, but once you get into the story, the numbers are not the central idea. So actually, the Hebrew name is more appropriate and more descriptive than the English coming from the Latin and the Greek. The purpose of this book is a record of the 40 years of wilderness wandering because of the sins of the people. And we will get into that. Actually, they sin multiple times, but especially when we come to chapters 12 and 13, that's when there's the big problem of the people's sin. In the context of the Pentateuch as a whole, all 5 books, this book is important. Leviticus gives us the law. Numbers gives us how the people actually applied the law. Okay, so first of all, Genesis, God creates and has a plan for humanity through the patriarchs. Exodus is salvation from Egypt and the giving of the law. Leviticus, how the people are to worship. Numbers tells us how the people actually implemented Leviticus. So how did they do? They didn't do very well. They didn't listen very closely. So Numbers is the preparation for what comes after, but it also illustrates more the human problem of sin. Numbers does. Number 3, it records the time from the first census until the final encampment near the promised land. So a lot of time is covered here, 40 years of the wilderness wandering. By the end of Numbers, the people are ready to cross over the Jordan. It shows us also the organization of the tribes into a mighty fighting force. But this is interrupted because they do not trust in God. God forms them into a great people and a great army, but they fail to go forth in faith, and because of that, God's plan for them is interrupted. The underlying theme is the complaints of the people. The people are just not happy. And they complain to Moses over and over again. They complain about food and water and all kinds of things. The divine response to their complaints is discipline. Numbers is the story of God's discipline of Israel. This was the growing up period of the people of Israel. This is kind of like, just think of a little child. by the end of Exodus and Leviticus, Israel's a little child. They don't know very much. They don't listen very much. They get themselves into trouble. And God has to teach them some hard lessons. And that's what the desert is all about. It's a time to grow up. And number 7, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 6, 7, yeah. Human freedom necessitates the law and discipline for disobeying the law. The people of Israel had the choice to obey God's law. And when they chose the wrong way, they experienced what the law said would happen to them. God warned them, but the people still rebelled, and so they had to be disciplined. There are 6 stages of movement in the book. Up until chapter 10, verse 10, they are on Mount Sinai still, where they had received the law. So this is very much still, in that area of the Sinai Peninsula. And then from chapter 10 to 12, they are making their way. I should get up a map here. Let's see. Let's check real quick if we can bring a map up. Let's put map of Numbers. Boy, these things are so nice these days. You can just do all kinds of things. Let's look at this. This looks like a nice map. Give it a second. Oh, wait a minute. No. That's not helpful. Open image, new tab. There we go. So, hope you can see that. So the people of Israel flee from Egypt, cross the Red Sea at some point. They come out down here to the Sinai Peninsula. And the traditional place of Mount Sinai is in this area. There's a lot of mountains here. So the first 10 chapters of Numbers is down here. And then the people go north into the area called Kadesh Barnea. This is just south of the Holy Land, the Promised Land. And Moses sends spies out. Chapter 13 through 10, they are in this area called Kadesh Barnea. Up until chapter 20. And so they have 38 years of wandering in the desert of this area. The wilderness of Paran, the wilderness of Zin. So they do not cross into the Promised Land. So total of 40 years. So after 38 years, chapter 20 to 21, they go from Kadesh into the valley of Moab near Pisgah. So they come down here. And then they're in the plains of Moab at the close of the book of Numbers. So by the book of Numbers, they're up in this area here. So Numbers begins down here, comes up here. Oh, come on. They come up here, they wander around for almost 40 years, and then they come up to the plains of Moab. And then the book of Joshua, they cross over into the Promised Land. It's kind of helpful just to see the map. I should put that map into the notes. So here they are, Sinai to Kadesh, Kadesh to the valley of Moab. I think that should be Moab, Moab. And then to the plains of Moab, opposite of Jericho. And then that's where they are at the end. The last part of Numbers, they're at Jericho. All right. Well, let's at least do a little bit here, and then I think we'll save the rest for next week. Okay, contents. There are three main sections to the book of Numbers, and this is really based on the geography where they were at the time. The first 10 chapters, this section deals with Sinai and preparations for departure. It talks about how the people are to care for the tabernacle. It lists the different tribes and how many people are in those tribes. And so we come to chapter 1, verse 46. It says 603,550. And then chapters 5 and 6 talks about, well, let me talk about this first of all. Mustering is a word used in the army. So that's where you gather the army together. They were to prepare for war. God was preparing them to go into the promised land and conquer it. And so every male, 20 years and older, was to be ready to fight. And so the assumption would be at the end of chapter 4 that the people of Israel are ready to go in and conquer the land. This section also gives the layout of the tribes around the tabernacle. And then chapters 5 and 6 are the purity of the camp. The people were to be ready for the land by being pure themselves. Anything impure was sent outside the camp. And then in chapter 6, there was a group of Israelites who were to be set aside. And these were called Nazarites. Not Nazarenes, a little bit different, but Nazarites. And the Nazarites, there are certain things that they couldn't do, like don't cut their hair, don't drink any alcohol, wine. They were to be consecrated. They couldn't even touch dead bodies and all kinds of things that are listed here. But they were to be set aside as a special group of people. And then chapter 7 and 8 talk about an offering for proper worship. The people were learning how to worship God. They were taught how to carry the tabernacle because now everything was portable. They needed to get ready to travel with the tabernacle. The holiest items were to be carried by people, not animals. The Levites were to be set aside to care for the tabernacle. Chapter 8, verses 20 and 22. The Levites were to purify themselves from sin, wash their clothes, and then after that, they would be ready to, move things. The Levites served in the tabernacle, but did not have the same function as the Levites. As the priests. They could not touch the holiest of items, nor could they perform the priestly functions. Their job was to care for other things, and when it came time to pack it up and move it all. In chapter 16, later on, there's a story of Korah, who was a Levite, and he tried to do the job of a priest. And because of that, he was found guilty. And so chapter 16 is Korah's rebellion. It was a lesson that the Levites could only do certain things. Chapter 9, they have a second Passover. Now, the first one is described in Exodus. Now, this is a year later. And then chapter 10, they prepare and they leave for Sinai. Prepare to leave from Sinai and get ready to travel. Now, the next part is where problems begin to emerge. Problems. In chapters 10 through 13, the people travel to Canaan. This section describes the 38 years of wilderness wandering. This part of Numbers stands out in a big way. It's very different, contrast to what comes before and what comes after. This middle section of the book of Numbers. This part of Numbers highlights the people's lack of faith. In the first part of Numbers, up until chapter 10, people are optimistic. They're excited. They're getting ready to go into the promised land. This is the fulfillment of God's promise to the patriarchs so many hundreds of years before. Now, the middle part, everything goes downhill. The optimism of the first part is now replaced by God's judgment in the second part. There's a pattern that takes place. The people complain. We see that in chapter 11. The people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. So the people complain. God responds with the judgment of fire. The people cry out to Moses. Number 3, Moses intercedes. Moses prayed to the Lord. Number 4, the fires die down. Number 4, God gives a lesson about that, a punishment. And number 5, a symbolic name is given to the place. These references, something happened to my references here. This should be 3, verse 3. The symbolic name is given, verse number 3. The symbolic name is given. So the name of that place was called Taberah, which means burning, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. So these people complained to God and experienced God's judgment. The complaint is focused on food, verse 5. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. It costs nothing. Isn't that funny? They didn't remember the slavery. And this was only a couple of years at most since the Exodus. This is not a lot of time yet. How quickly people forget. So the irony is in the words, no cost. They forgot the slavery that they experienced and all the hardship. But actually, what was happening? Verse 20. But a whole month until it comes out at your nostrils, and because it becomes loathsome to you. But here, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and has wept before him, saying, Why did we come out of Egypt? So here's the real problem, is that they had actually rejected God. And then the decision to follow or reject God's offer. And that's in chapter 13. I think we'll stop right there. And I'll just mark that as the place we want to come back to. Let's just think about this pattern right here. And think about it in terms of application for our own lives. How quickly do we forget the blessings of God? That God has done things for us in the past, our families, our nations, our churches. God has blessed us, and we complain. And we think that, oh, the life of sin was so nice. There was no cost to it. And there's something that entices us to go back because we think that sin, our old life, we think that our old life will be so much better. There's something tempting about it. It makes these promises to us. These people were following false promises. Oh, if we go back to Egypt, then we can have our melons, our cucumbers. What else they say there? Our onions. All this good food. Now all we get is this manna. And so, pretty sad. Well, what do you think? What do you think about these people?